Well, welcome everyone. I'm Nancy Greer. I'm the president and the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, and am really thrilled to be here today to share with you really the rollout of our Jewish Community Relations Council. For those of you who have been around a long time, you know that this is not the Federation's first time to this rodeo. We years ago, many years ago, had a JCRC and it sunset in the 80s. And it's back. So first I want you to know that we're recording today's session. So you'll see a little red button. We're recording, so best behavior, because it's gonna live on. Also really, we want today to be an information session. We want to inform you. We want to share what the goals and the next steps of the JCRC are. We want you to come away excited so you find a way to get involved. And we also want to answer your questions. So you're going to hear quite a bit today. You're going to hear about the basics of the JCRC. You're going to hear about how the community can and is involved and can get further involved. And like I said, we're going to answer your questions. So I'm going to just start out by sharing first. One of the people we're going to meet today is the first chair of our new JCRC, and that is Bill Mowat. Bill, wave hi. You're going to hear from him in a little bit. We're thrilled that Bill joined in this leadership capacity. We're so excited. So with that as a background, why are we starting a JCRC? Some of you were involved in the convening process that the Federation initiated in May of 2017. And I see Hillary, I see David, Bill, I think you were part of it, Ron, many others. And through that process, which started in 2017, where we convened a number of community leaders, both professional and lay, we concluded as a group that what we needed in Seattle was a way to form a more cohesive community. So here we are, it's 2020. I'd say that's still true. And the work that we've done in the last 3 years to substantiate, first, what we thought as a group, as a leadership group, the tactics are that we should employ for a more cohesive community. One of those tactics or strategies is the formation or reformation of a Jewish Community Relations Council. So the Federation took that on as an initiative it would study, and we formed, as nonprofit organizations are prone to do with the proper governance, we formed a task force and then a committee, because you have to study these things if you're going to make an investment. And it was an extremely effective process, because while it took a long time, what we were able to establish, first of all, we engaged a lot of people. I mean, I think Max will maybe share over 100 leaders across the community, lay and professional, in the various discussions and meetings about this formation. And we reviewed what was being done in the community, what was being done well, what was being done and could use some turbocharging, and where the gaps were in the community. And we did conclude that the formation of a JCRC would really inure to the benefit of our Jewish community and our broader community. So in June of 2019, the Federation board voted to move ahead with the formation of a JCRC. And we've spent the last year figuring out how to structure it. And it was a very intensive process. We looked at JCRCs across the country. We were engaged with Rabbi Doug Kahn, who ran the San Francisco JCRC for over 30 years and is the country's really foremost expert in this subject, to really figure out, well, what do we need in Seattle? What's the right structure? What's the right form? What's the right governance? And we did that. We had a subgroup of lay leaders, of attorneys who helped us draft those operating procedures. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but it has catapulted us to this moment where we have a Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Seattle, in Seattle. Bill Mowat, it's a chair. Our Max Potashnik will be the director. And with her team of Cassie Garvin and Eliza Mossman, we are really going to, together with so many of you, do remarkable things for our community. We're very excited about it. We think the timing, it's almost as if, you know, it's just in time JCRC. There are so many things going on between institutional racism and just social, you know, racial equity, anti-Semitism, annexation, the election in November. I mean, you don't need to, you know, get beyond the first headline to say, oh, if only we had a JCRC. And look, now we do. So I'm excited. I'm going to turn things over to Max, who's going to really give us the basics, just sort of for those of you who are joining who aren't all that familiar with the basics of a JCRC and what its role is. Max is going to walk us through that. So take it away, Max.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nancy. Really appreciate your leadership on this and making sure that this is a priority for our community. For those of you who are familiar faces on here, it's great to see you. For those of you who I do not know yet, I hope to get to know you over the next several years. By way of background, I've been with the Federation a little over 5 years now, and I've been our Director of Government and Community Relations for the last year or two, but really started in that government relations field. And before I was with the Federation, I worked with Washington State Legislature in a couple of different capacities. So advocacy is really kind of my bread and butter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a JCRC, what does the JCRC community look like, what kinds of issues are we going to be working on, what is the benefit going to be to our community, and then I'll turn it over to our chair, Bill Mowat. So one thing I can't remember, I apologize, Nancy, if you mentioned, is if you have a question, please go ahead and use the Q&A function to raise your hand, and we can answer your question in that capacity, or you can go ahead and chat either of the hosts, Cassie or Eliza, and ask your question that way, and they'll be sure either to just interject and ask us throughout, or to ask it at the end. So we'll certainly have time for questions. We hope that this will be an interactive experience for everybody. So what is a JCRC? For those of you who don't know, a JCRC is a body that represents the organized Jewish community to the broader community. We work on advancing core Jewish interests by building bridges and relationships with other communities, ethnic and religious leaders, public officials, media, school officials, and by educating and advocating on issues that are of critical importance to our community. And we do this through building consensus across the membership of the JCRC across the council. You might be wondering, are there JCRCs in other communities? Why, yes, there are. There are about 120 JCRCs across the country, and they are all connected by a national network called the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Each one is an independent entity. No other JCRC is bound by what another JCRC in the country does, but they all have a similar mission and a similar mandate: to protect the interests of the Jewish community by enhancing understanding and support from other communities and the broader community, and by finding issues of common cause with the other communities. So of the 120 JCRCs in the country, as I was saying, about 105 of them are part of their federation. The remainder either have a large community that can support an independent JCRC, or they're a community that is one of those first founding JCRCs and has a really long history there. So, and the ones that are independent still maintain a close partnership with their federation. So when and why were JCRCs formed? Doug Kahn, who Nancy mentioned, was head of the San Francisco JCRC for almost 3 decades, has given us some expertise and a little bit of humor in that area. And he likes to say that Jewish community relations really started and have been practiced since the moment that Jews stepped into the diaspora. Joseph in Egypt, Esther in Shushan. But the formal field, the formal entities of JCRCs were created in around 1944 in the late 1940s, near the end of the Holocaust, when the Federation movement determined that really one of the fatal flaws of the American Jewish response to the Holocaust was our lack of a united voice on the paramount issues of the day. And to remedy that flaw, that umbrella body should be established to try and develop consensus and then be able to speak with a much united and stronger voice in representing the Jewish community to the broader community. So in addition to the Holocaust and why JCRCs in their current current format were formed, some of the other issues that JCRCs have really been known for and playing a leadership role in are the Soviet Jewry advocacy movement, fighting for civil rights, addressing anti-Semitism, bigotry, racism, immigration issues, and being really visible as well in the Israel-American relations movement, especially against the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So as Nancy mentioned, Seattle had a JCRC a time ago. It sunset in the early 90s. And we went through a really inclusive and comprehensive process that we are very fortunate is culminating today at this point in time, to make sure that we have a really strong foundation for our JCRC here in Seattle. We drew from the best practices, both in the guidelines and the values and the operating procedures from JCRCs across the country to make sure that ours here in Seattle is able to step up and fill the needs in our communities. In terms of the unique value of JCRCs, I really think that our mission and vision help illuminate and speak to that. The JCRC of Greater Seattle, this is, and I'm reading, leverages the strength and the heart of Puget Sound's diverse Jewish community to secure a vibrant Jewish future locally in Israel and around the world, and to champion a just, democratic, and pluralistic society. The JCRC convenes and mobilizes our community, educates and advocates on issues of vital concern based on Jewish values, consensus, and respect for our diversity, and builds bridges within and beyond the Jewish community, focused on core issues, including combating anti-Semitism, bigotry, and racism, supporting a peaceful, secure, and Jewish democratic state of Israel, fostering positive and meaningful relations with other communities and public officials, and strengthening our Jewish communities through building cohesion and civil discourse. And it really is very much this dual mission of bringing the Jewish community together to address issues that are going on within our community, to build cohesion, to build consensus, and this external mission of supporting issues that are important to other communities so we can build in stronger relationships with them and be in partnership, as well as supporting institutions and areas that have really allowed the Jewish community to thrive and protected the Jewish community as a minority not in Washington State, in this country. So those are issues like separation of church and state and public education, and making sure that our community is safe and well cared for. So really that duality of mission. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what our JCRC will look like. So Elisa, may I have the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So this chart may be a little bit hard to read, but just kind of scoot up close and get comfy with your screen, or listen to what I'm saying and describing. So our new federation, our new JCRC, much like the 105 JCRCs in the country, will be a department of our federation. Some of our activities will be co-branded and some will be branded as JCRC in consultation with the federation. We will have a council, a community council that's composed of representatives of both member organizations as well as at-large representatives. This council will meet 3 to 4 times a year, and is going to be the main policy making and consensus building body of the community. The board, there'll be a board of directors. The board members will serve on the council and will also meet more frequently to be able to address issues and challenges that arise in between council meetings and be able to set the strategic direction of the JCRC and make sure that each of the standing committees is working together towards the goals of the JCRC. The council, as I mentioned, is the principal deliberative body of the JCRC, seeking consensus on issues, and the board provides oversight. Checks and balances have been put in place to ensure that our new issues are considered in partnership with the Federation and the JCRC board chair. And in addition, the board and the council, there are several slots for Federation representatives on the JCRC board to make sure that there is collaboration and communication, and we're working together. In addition, as you can see, there are 4 standing committees, one on membership, one on public advocacy, one on Israel affairs, and one on intergroup relations. I mentioned the membership committee specifically because not many JCRCs have a year-round membership committee, but we really want to make sure that our JCRC is a place where members of the community feel welcome, that they see themselves reflected in the JCRC membership. And so the membership committee of the JCRC will really have a focus not only on ensuring that we have a strong pipeline of leaders for the JCRC and that folks who are engaged with the JCRC have the knowledge, background, and education that they need to do their work well, but also because we want to make sure that the JCRC is really a diverse entity. And in our nominating committee, which has been put together to try and put together the initial leadership of the JCRC, making sure that we have diversity across the Jewish community represented is one of our top priorities, working on that. The Public Advocacy Committee will continue to take on a lot of the awesome advocacy work that the Federation has been doing, engaging a broader cross-section of the community on issues that we are identified, through the community survey that we put out each year, and other capacities as well. The Israel Affairs Committee is going to be focused on building relationships with the non-Jewish community around Israel and potentially around education on issues related to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was identified in an informal gap analysis that we did as one of the biggest issue areas where more work is needed in our community. The second area that was identified in that gap analysis was strengthening the work that we do on intergroup relations, seeing that our Jewish community is experiencing record levels of anti-Semitism, seeing the other challenges that other communities are experiencing, like institutional oppression and immigration concerns around immigrants, refugees, and asylees, that this is a big area that there is a lot of work to be done here in our community. And the third area of work that was identified is doing more civil discourse work, right? So our community, much as a reflection of the broader community, is more polarized than it really has been in quite a long time, both politically, across generations. And so being able to really have a place where we can learn from one another, where we can come to a common table, where we can deepen our understanding, and if not reach consensus, which is the ultimate goal of the JCRC, at least be able to listen and work with each other in a civil way. So with that, I think, Aliza, it's a great time for the next slide. Great. So as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned, the council is going to have both institutional members, those are organizations of some kind, and at-large members. And in terms of the JCRC and organizations or institutional members, one really easy follow-up thing that you can do from this webinar is ensure that if you, and Cassie's going to talk a little bit later about what the specific requirements are, but if you have an organization that you're engaged with, potentially a synagogue or an agency, or maybe your kids go to a camp or a day school, you can check and see, are the institutions that you're engaged with working towards JCRC membership? Because there are a lot of benefits, and the broader diversity we have in our JCRC, both amongst individuals as well as institutions, really the stronger we're going to be. And so here on the slide, you can see just some of the benefits of being an institutional member. I was talking about a communal table around we can gather to discuss complex issues, build consensus, and develop policy positions. Opportunities to engage with a broader diversity of our community, right? Many of us are in our own bubbles, whether they are generational or political, and we don't step outside our spheres. So this is an opportunity to hear and learn different perspectives and practice civil discourse. Also, the ability to be more directly engaged in advocacy, coalition building, intergroup relations. We all have limited bandwidth and capacity, so to have an entity here in our community who is focused explicitly on advocacy, intergroup relations, and Israel affairs, if you or somebody you know is interested in getting engaged in those areas, working on one of the standing committees is a great spot to do that. And then lastly, the JCRC is a resource for our community and our communal organizations. When there are sensitive or challenging issues facing an institution, or they need help working through those, the JCRC is here to step up and to help out and to serve. And so one of the last things I'm going to talk about is how does the JCRC work with organizations? We've gotten a lot of questions, the AGC does great work, or my synagogue's doing great work in this area, or the ADL does, or whatever that might look like. We want you to know that the work of the JCRC, there are several pieces that make it really powerful and effective. One is looking at this collective work that's being done across our community by a number of really fantastic organizations, and being able to bring those groups together, the representatives together, and leverage and build on the work that they are doing for our collective good. The second thing is that a lot of these organizations have a national entity, and some of their work and their agenda and their policies, are driven by what's going on nationally and where their partners are across the country. One of the unique things about the JCRC is that it's really focused solely here on our community and what's best for our community. While we will receive guidance and we can have support from JCRCs and from the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, this is really uber focused on of, by, and for our community. And so the policy positions that are taken up and adopted and the work that we do is really reflective of our unique needs here as a community. And I think, let me just make sure that there wasn't anything that nope, I don't think there's anything that I left out. Happy to answer more questions when they come up. And in the meantime, what I would love to do is introduce our fearless chair. So Bill Mallett, we are so grateful for you. Regardless of what he knew he was stepping into or not, now he's accepted. So we are very grateful for that. And for those of you who don't know Bill, he graduated from Brown in 1984 with a degree in computer science. He worked for 4 years at Data General Corporation in Research Triangle Park and moved to Seattle then to work at Microsoft as a software developer. He's married and has a daughter who lives in Annapolis. The Mallets are members of Congregation Beth Shalom here in Seattle, and Bill has been on numerous community boards. He began volunteering with the ADL in 2005, serving as board chair of the Pacific Northwest region for 3 years, starting in 2011, and he's currently on the executive committee of the ADL. He's a member of the ADL's Global Advisory Council at the national level, engaged in many other civic and community efforts, and enjoys hiking, music, reading, and cooking. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Max. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all today. Some people I recognize and others I look forward to knowing soon. I want to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle for establishing and funding this JCRC. I believe that the JCRC will be great for our community, and I'm excited to take on the role of board chair. When Rabbi Kahn came to Seattle 2 years ago to work with the Federation, one of the things that impressed me the most in watching him work was his focus on civil discourse. Making civil discourse a priority in our discussions is one of my goals and one of the reasons I am excited about the JCRC and being board chair. One of the JCRC's priorities is promoting cohesion and inclusion within our local Jewish community. I'm excited about helping make this happen. By cohesion, I mean making connections, learning who we each are and what we care about, and finding areas of commonality. I look forward to the challenge of working toward consensus on some key issues for our community. By inclusion, I mean reaching out, welcoming, and engaging many Jewish groups, some of which are not part of any current conversation. I also mean including Jews of color, young Jewish adults, and non-affiliated Jews. Another of the JCRC's priorities is fostering positive and meaningful relationships with other communities and public officials. We will be able to speak on behalf of our community when there is consensus. I believe in supporting a peaceful, secure, Jewish, and democratic state of Israel. I also plan to listen to a diverse range of voices within our community on this topic and have meaningful, productive, and useful conversations, even when we disagree. Many of us, including me, are emotional and passionate about Israel. This can make civil discourse a challenge, but this is exactly why we need it. Finally, I care deeply about combating anti-Semitism, bigotry, and racism. I plan to help the JCRC work to establish proactive and reactive strategies to address the serious and sustained resurgence of anti-Semitism we have seen throughout the country and in our region. It's also important to me to engage in the work of building a 21st century civil rights movement that centers the Jewish and Black community in the United States, a movement that understands the importance of not only taking on racism, but also anti-Semitism. I hope to meet each of you over the next 2 years that I am board chair and help us come together to secure a vibrant Jewish future that we can all be proud of. Thanks, everyone. And that's it for me. I'll turn it over to Cassie.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Garvin. I am the Intergroup Relations and Israel Affairs Manager for the JCRC. I've worked at the Federation for about 4 years in an advocacy community relations role working with Max, and really excited to be part of the JCRC and where we're going. My role going forward will be really focused on staffing and working with the Intergroup Relations Committee and the Israel Affairs Committee that Max mentioned. So I will share a bit about who's going to be part of the JCRC. We've heard a lot about it. Max spoke at some length about organizations, and I'll get there in a moment. You've all just met Bill, who we're thrilled to have as our board chair for this first iteration of the JCRC. We had a provisional nominating committee that came up with our initial JCRC leadership, and we are in the process of making those asks and getting together the board. Really looking forward to having them all together virtually in the next month or two, we hope. Then beyond the board, we get to the council, where there are many slots for organizational representatives. There are some requirements for organizations to be eligible to be part of the JCRC. They need to be 501c3s or not-for-profits that are exempt from federal taxes. And they need to be in existence for 2 years. They need to serve a local constituency, and they need to have at least 100 members, which could be donors, program participants, actual members for synagogues. And by locally, we mean here in the Puget Sound region. That's the area of that the JCRC is planning to cover, and that organizations are eligible to join if they're in Puget Sound. The other really critical piece for the organizations need to meet the requirements of JCRC is that they formally stipulate to the mission, vision, and core principles. Max shared the mission and vision earlier of the JCRC, and our core goals and principles are on our website. And please feel free to check out the website as well. Plug for that. It's looking beautiful. Thank you to our marketing team. And the other component of that is that organizations, to be a part of the JCRC, really have to value the importance of and be engaged in community relations work to be members. Those are the criteria. We are in the process of accepting applications for our first round of institutional members, which has been going on for a few weeks. And our first round of organizational application will close in a couple of weeks. So make sure to get in touch with your institution if you want to ensure they're in the process of getting in their applications. Beyond the institutional members, well, something that's really exciting about the JCRC is the ability to bring together our institutions to amplify our impact. The other piece of it that I'm really excited about is ensuring that the JCRC is a welcoming and inclusive place for people who are traditionally underrepresented by our communal institutions. And to that end, there are a number of at-large positions on the council. So folks who may not be eligible to be involved in an institutional capacity can still be involved in the really important work of building consensus in our community. And those are setting up some of the ways folks can get involved is obviously through the council and the board. The other is, my colleague, Eliza Mossman, is going to share more about other ways community members can get involved in JCRC.
Thank you, Cassie. I'm Eliza Mossman. I'm the JCRC and Advocacy Associate for the Federation. I'll be supporting the operations of the JCRC, assisting with our advocacy work, and running our student-to-student program. I've been at the Jewish Federation for about 3 years, just a little over, but I'm new to joining the JCRC team with Max and Cassie, and I'm really excited about about the launch of the JCRC. So Cassie covered a couple of the ways, but I'm here to tell you about how else community members can get involved with the JCRC. So again, if you belong to an organization or a synagogue, an institution who would have an institutional member, that's one way to plug in. If you could be their organizational representative on the council. And then another big way, as Cassie mentioned, is serving as an at-large member, either on the board, the council, or on our 3 standing committees. They're all opportunities for just any community member interested in the work of the JCRC to plug in and have a voice and as we build consensus and with our work. And then of course, you're able to sign up for our email distribution list and advocacy action alerts. We'll be working hard to communicate with everyone about the work the JCRC is doing, especially as we get all the pieces off the ground. So you're welcome to email anyone on our team or at jcrc@jewishinseattle.org with any specific pieces. But again, just getting on our email distribution list is a great way so we can connect with you as we get everything off the ground. So I think now we're going to just a general Q&A to answer any questions anyone might have.
While we wait for questions to come in, I know we got a few questions in advance that I'll just address briefly. So one was a number of questions about specifics in terms of the operations of the JCRC. So as I mentioned before, our JCRC will be a part of the Federation. It does have its own board of directors and the council, and will be a consensus based body based on community input and the folks who are at that table. It will be staffed by 3 professionals, myself, Cassie, and Eliza from the Federation. And in terms of resources, the JCRC will constitute a little under 5% or so of the Federation's budget in terms of where we're going there. And another question that I know came in, very relevant in terms of what's going on today, is how will the JCRC ensure that there are Black and Brown Jews and Jews, I'm going to add other Jews of color as well, who are engaged. And as you heard from our chair, Bill Mowat, that's something that he is really committed to. I can share in the work that our provisional nominating committee has been doing as well, that making sure that we have Jews from diverse backgrounds and lots of identities within the Jewish community represented at the table. So that's another focus area. And then as well, in terms of the membership committee, I can say, well, I can't share publicly in terms of who the chair of that committee is yet. I can say that for the chair, that is an absolute top priority in their book as well. So it's really, it's both, it's in our mission, it's in our vision, it's in our core principles and goals. It's also reflected in both the professional and lay leadership here in terms of what's important to us.
Thanks, Max. We have had a couple of questions come in the chat. So I'll say, one of the questions is, what is the time commitment, and will meetings be held over Zoom?
I think, so the time commitment would be a bit different for different roles, right? So the council, as we mentioned, will meet 3 to 4 times a year, probably just 3 times a year at the outset. But what makes a really strong council member, certainly an institutional one, is an individual who has a strong connection to the organization that they're representing. So ideally, if you're already on a board of another organization and engaged with that one, then that would be a really great connection in terms of the JCRC. So that is a mutually beneficial relationship. So while the JCRC council meetings will only be 3 to 4 times a year, you want to build in that other commitment. The JCRC board will meet 8 times a year, and also on an as-needed basis, so that time commitment is going to be greater. And then in addition, each of the standing committees have yet to set their meeting schedule, but they'll probably meet every 4 to 8 weeks, depending on what that time commitment is. So it would be anywhere. And if you are lucky enough to be asked to be chair of the JCRC and accept, you can expect your time commitment to be, oh, I don't know, about 40 hours a month. So we're extremely grateful, like I said, to Bill. So there's a range there, and finding a way to be engaged that fits within your capacity and your availability is something that, you know, we really want to work with folks on. And in terms of Zoom, yes, you know, until it is safe to gather in person again, and we will be really grateful when that is the case, we will likely be meeting and working over Zoom, yes, or some other virtual platform. However, I will say that I will say we have some really incredible professionals who have engaged in how to make Zoom the most meaningful and interactive experiences possible. So we'll be utilizing things like chat function and polls and breakout rooms so we can really get an opportunity to build relationships, even though it will be challenging during this time.
Great. Thanks, Max. We've had a couple of questions come in about membership fees. Are there any fees associated or dues associated with being a member of the JCRC?
No.
Nope.
Yes, excellent. It's a great, easy answer. Beautiful. We also had another question come through. What is the JCRC's definition of consensus for the purpose of launching initiatives and making public advocacy statements?
Well, consensus for the council is defined in our operating procedures as 75%. So a consensus position is 75% or more. There is the opportunity in the council and its policymaking work that if there is a minority position that is expressed by enough folks at the table, that will be formally adopted into any policy position. So for example, you know, I've been part of policy work at the national level with Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and our process, most of the JCRC process really mirrors kind of what happens at the JCPA level. And we've been debating any number of policies, and there might be a group like, you know, the URJ or the Orthodox Union or whoever it might be who might have an objection to what's going on. And there is a way to make a formal announcement isn't the right word, sorry, that's what's coming to me. The formal record of a position of dissent. But, you know, we're not going to be looking to say, and Bill, you may want to add to this too, oh, we've got, you know, 75%, let's ram it through. You know, it's really about building relationships, building understanding, and figuring out where we can find, it's not if, but really where we can find that consensus across our community.
Yeah, I would add to that just to say, I agree that I want to make sure that that we listen to all the different positions and we understand each other well and that people feel heard. And, you know, hopefully we can come to a very strong consensus, which is, you know, more like 90% or even 100%. But, you know, if we can't, we can't. But I'm going to try to make us get as close to that as we can.
Great. Thank you both. We've had another question come in. If you're representing an organization, how much is that member expected to represent the organization's view rather than their own?
I would say completely. Yeah, if you're an at-large member, you're there to represent your own viewpoint. If you're an organizational or institutional member, you know, that is at the ask of that institution or that organization. And the other piece of that I will say is that when Cassie talked about requirements for institutional membership, she said that they're engaged in community relations work and they formally stipulate that they agree and support the mission, vision, and core goals and principles of the JCRC. So while an individual would be there to represent their institution or their organization, they're not there to just push their organization's point of view to make sure, hopefully to make sure that that is the position that is adopted by the council or the body. They're really there to share that position, to share that insight, to share that perspective, and to work with everybody else. So it's a both and piece.
Great. What have the experiences been for JCRCs and other communities with regard to broader community relationships and to Black Lives Matter?
So that's a great question. I think it really depends, as I spoke at the beginning, that every JCRC is an independent entity and every JCRC is focused on working specifically with their community and where their community needs are. So if you look across the country, the priorities and the work and the relationships that are developed by the JCRC of Palm Beach versus the JCRC of Minneapolis versus the JCRC of Portland are going to be vastly different based on what their community needs are, what the demographics of their community are, and what the goals and priorities of their JCRC are. So with that, I would say it's a really diverse set of experiences, right? I think there are JCRCs in the country that are just starting to do some learning about racism and institutional oppression because they've been focused on other issues in other areas. And there are some JCRC directors who have been, and chairs who have been in really deep relationship and partnership with their African American and Black leaders in their community. And I would say, the work of Black Lives Matter and it being, really a 21st century civil rights movement, as Bill said, for our country, is the significance of that means that JCRCs across the country are grappling with what does it mean for their community to be engaged in the work that is meaningful and authentic to them, and that still really shows up for that, right? Because being the central address for the Jewish community and building relationships with other communities means that there's a lot of work to be done there. And also the other side of that work is recognizing and working with our own multiracial Jewish community, which I know is something that JCRCs across the country are grappling with as well.
Great. This question is specifically for Nancy and Max, so I'm not sure which one of you wants to respond first. Could you ever imagine the JCRC and the Federation having differing positions on an issue?
It's possible. I mean, so I think the way that the operating procedures were built and developed was, to minimize that possibility. And yet it does happen, I suppose, that a JCRC will want to take a position on something that could possibly not align with the Federation. And the operating procedures specifically address how we proceed in that case. So if there were a matter or an issue where there was not reconciliation, the executive committee of the JCRC would meet with the executive committee of the Federation, and they would discuss. And since it's not happened, I can't speak to it and how it would resolve itself, but the idea would be to discuss it, to bring it to resolution, and in a civil way, because that's what it's all about. And so I think that's the best I can offer at this time. And Max, you may have spoken to Doug about situations that have occurred in other communities where this has been the case, because as we have heard, over 100 JCRCs are part of the Community Federation. And so conflict is clearly a possibility.
Well, and I think, thank you, Nancy. And I'm not going to talk about a specific example, just that, when you're talking about the way we work through it civilly, I think that's really important, right? I think it's likely that at some point a disagreement is going to happen. We are not the exact same entity with the exact same representation. And so that's possible, right? But whether that turns into conflict or not is something that's on us and something I don't see, in the foreseeable future. I do know of occurrences, it's funny, one of our JCRC colleagues has talked about the different tools that different communities like to use, and how the Jewish community is really big on statements where, in their work with their local African American community, they're really big on press releases. So the example I'm going to say, not press releases, press conferences. So the example I'm going to use is a statement that when an issue has come up in the past, that there are times when a federation and its JCRC may issue different statements because it's a really important issue, and they're going to have different perspectives that they lend to it. So absolutely possible, and absolutely something that we have foreseen, and we have a great way to work together and work through it.
Great. Several more questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. One is sort of a housekeeping thing, so I'm happy to answer it, which is, if you've made it to this info session, does that mean you're on the mailing list for the JCRC? The answer is not necessarily. So we'll send an email follow-up after our session today, the link to make sure you get signed up for JCRC communications in the future. And then I'll go back to our list of questions here. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in various progressive left-wing organizations, including the Women's March and other places, which have been reticent to call out anti-Semitism. How do you see the JCRC dealing with that?
Carefully, thoughtfully. No, really, both of those. And I think maybe it's not unique to JCRC, but a big part of it is showing up and being present, right? So how would the JCRC deal with that? Hopefully not through making statements to people and entities that we've never met or never engaged with before, but through building relationships. At its core, the JCRC is a community relations building body. And that means that our top priority is building relationships with other communities. And so the way, for example, if we're going to take the Women's March to be building relationships, is that we have folks, women primarily probably, though there are plenty of male allies who have engaged with the Women's March as well, who reach out to and build relationships with the leaders of the Women's March and with other movements, and who are able to have conversations and address some of those complex and nuanced issues as they relate to anti-Semitism in the progressive community, whether that's related to Israel or whether that's not related to Israel. I think what we all have seen over the last year with the highest levels of anti-Semitism in decades is that anti-Semitism comes from quite a number of places and, you know, across the spectrum, right, left, right, and everywhere in between. Certainly present in the right and the alt-right and the white supremacy movements, and comes up in different ways already right now in political campaigns and places. And it's also present, you know, in the left, and you see elements of anti-Semitism popping up with recent controversies around, you know, professional athletes and otherwise. So the bottom line is that how is the JCRC going to address it? Thoughtfully, through consensus building, figuring out what the most effective way to move forward is, but ultimately really through a lot of that relationship building and connections and making change. Do we have the tools of advocacy? Yes. Do we have the tools you know, to make statements? Absolutely. But I think one of the things that Cassie would certainly agree with me, and being on the JCRC listservs for a long time, is that a statement is not always the best tool. In fact, it's oftentimes not the most effective tool. So what else can we use? What else can we do to make effective change?
Great. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can. Another question that's come in is, how will we deal with institutions in smaller Puget Sound communities? Specifically, what are addressing different needs that communities might have in Olympia versus in Seattle, and so forth?
I'm struggling a little bit to understand the question. I don't know if it's like specific needs, like, you know, crisis management or sensitive issues, or if we're talking about like agenda setting. So I'm going to go with both and try and do both briefly, which is, if issues and institutions have sensitive or challenging issues that they need help addressing or dealing with, we will do the best we can with the resources and time that we are allowed to help each and every one of them. The second piece in terms of agenda setting is that really each of the committee chairs for the standing committee is going to work together in conjunction with the JCRC leadership, Bill, and the board of directors to figure out, you know, how their work is going to fit into the goals and priorities of the JCRC in any given year and in the strategic direction. So it will be a collaborative process, and it really is informed. It's really kind of both and, right? So some communities are engaged. I'm going to give one quick example. They're working on combating anti-Semitism, and then they realize they have holes in their anti-Semitism policy, and they've got to go and say, well, our council needs to pass a resolution on anti-Semitism. Or we might say, you know, we've never done work before on immigration reform, and so we need a policy to create immigration reform because that's the top priority for the Latinx community that we're building a relationship with. So it's organic, and then there's some organization and collaboration around it.
Great. I guess I'll post to you, Max. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I think we have 5 minutes left, so we could do 1 or 2 more, depending on how little I talk and how much other people talk.
Sure. And this next question says, I've noticed a blurriness in American Jewish community between supporting Israel and supporting Likud. Supporting Likud. How is this line addressed?
That's a really interesting question, and I wish that I could have a conversation with the individual who is posing this question. I think it's really important that the JCRC be a place where, as Bill mentioned, there's a diversity of viewpoints that is respected and engaged in the conversation, and that as a Jewish community, we make a distinction between supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish, independent, democratic state, as a Jewish homeland, and being distinct from specific policies, whether they come from Likud or they come from any other party in Israel. So that will certainly be a distinction that we draw, and I think something that will absolutely come up in building relationships with other communities.
Great. There's another question which asks more specifically about the budget. You'd mentioned that the budget for the JCRC is 6% of the Federation budget, and how much is that? And how much does the JCRC need to be successful and fully funded?
So that's a great question. I think it was a little under 5% was the answer. And between programming and between staffing, I would say that number is moving right now, is movable, because there are a number of programs that the Federation has been doing that the JCRC may take on in this first year. And then we may decide that they aren't appropriate programs for the JCRC, or we may decide to continue to do them. So that number is not finite, I would say. And secondly, I would say in communities such as ours, they would say a JCRC is fully staffed and has usually 3 to 5 staff people. I would be elated if we had 2 more staff people, and that would be wonderful.
Okay. I think I've done my best, I hope, to get to everyone's questions. I'll make sure to pull the chat and follow up with individuals if I didn't get to your question offline. So then I think Max, you'll wrap it up for us?
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time to tune in on this beautiful, beautiful Friday afternoon. As Nancy has mentioned in so many of our staff meetings recently, this is the weather we stick around this area for all year. So hope you have an opportunity to go out and enjoy it. We will follow up, as Cassie mentioned, with a thank you note. There will be a link to the JCRC website in there, as well as an email address if you want to get in touch with us with more questions. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a beautiful relationship with the community, and look forward to engaging all of you. And again, a deep thanks to Nancy for her leadership and the Federation's leadership in this recreation process, to Bill for his leadership in taking on this role, to our awesome staff, Cassie and Eliza, and to many other JCRC, future JCRC leaders I see with us this afternoon. So thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.